Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at the classic western, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So with this being a classic, I wanted to explore why you probably should watch this movie if you're a fan of westerns, or even if you're not a fan of westerns, it's still relatively decent. Now, with this movie being 51 years old at the time of this recording, there's really no need to say spoiler warning. We've long passed that threshold. This will be like my other retrospectives where we look at the creative team, the characters, the story, and how the movie was received. Now, before we get started, if you want to keep up to date with all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, follow the official blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com. There will be a link in the description of whatever platform you are viewing this on. So without further delay, let's tear right into Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now let's start things off with the creative team. This movie was directed by George Roy Hill. Now, he might be a name that you don't immediately recognize, but you might recognize some of his movies. He would go on to do the movie adaptation of Slaughterhouse-Five in 1972. He did The Sting with Robert Redford and Paul Newman, The Great Waldo Pepper with Robert Redford, and the movie Slapshot with Paul Newman, The World According to Garp with Robin Williams, and the final movie that he ever did, Funny Farm with Chevy Chase. Now, the writer of this movie would be William Goldman. Now, he would go on to write movies such as Papillon with Dustin Hoffman and Steve McQueen, All the President's Men with Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford, Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman, A Bridge Too Far, the classic war epic about the taking of the Nijmegen Bridge and the other bridges in Germany, The Princess Bride with Cary Elwes and Mandy Patinkin, and he also wrote the book that that movie was based on. Misery with James Caan and Kathy Bates, and the movie Chaplin starring a very young Robert Downey Jr. before his Iron Man days. Now with the creative team out of the way, let's move on to our character analysis. So obviously we're going to start off with Paul Newman as Butch Cassidy. He's the charismatic leader of the duo. Now, we don't really see the hole-in-the-wall gang very much through this movie, but he's the idea man, the man with the plan, so to speak. Then we've got Robert Redford as Sundance, or the Sundance Kid, referred to as Sundance in the movie. He's the quiet guy, but was the brute compared to Butch Cassidy. He was the man who would carry out the plan by using his six-shooter, given that he was the sharpshooter between the two of them. He's essentially the opposite of Butch. He doesn't talk his way out of things, he shoots his way out. And we really see this when they get to Bolivia. Butch is supposed to handle the talking during the bank robberies, and Sundance is really just there for the crowd control. And finally, we see Catherine Ross as Etta Place, and she's the quote-unquote love interest for both of these characters. Now, she's a different type of love interest in the sense that Butch and Sundance aren't really fighting over her. She's there to feed them, stitch them up, and teach them Spanish later in the movie. That's fine for a movie like this since its only goal is to showcase Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, hence the title of the movie. And every other character in this movie is just created to give the story some tension. The rest of the mainline characters are really people that are either hunting down Butch and Sundance. The hole-in-the-wall gang is shown for the first train robbery and then is not really seen again after that. Without the other characters essentially hunting down Butch and Sundance, this probably would have made for a very boring movie. So now that we've discussed the characters, now let's talk about the narrative. Now, the movie's opening credits open with showing a silent film that acts as an introduction to the hole-in-the-wall gang. You learn everything you really need to know about them during this first couple of minutes, that way the movie can just jump right into the story of Butch and Sundance. And the movie opens with one of the gang members challenging Butch for leadership in a knife fight. Now, Butch being the charismatic type of character that can talk his way out, and does initially by trying to establish the rules of a knife fight. Rules? What rules to a knife fight? While his opponent is distracted, Butch kicks the other man in the balls and ultimately wins the fight without ever having to pull out his knife at all. We then go to the train robbery. Now, the gang is going to hit the train when it's first going to its destination and when it's returning from its destination, because the logic is no one would be stupid enough to rob the same train twice. Now, in my opinion, that is a solid way of thinking, but it can very easily backfire. The best case scenario, the other guy thinks that the idea of robbing the same train twice is too dumb for anyone to do, so the guy who you're robbing doesn't send out any protection, and so that easy pickings. And the worst case scenario is that the guy who you are robbing is planning for the idiocracy part of your plan and sends out enough protection to essentially put up a fight. And after this is when we're introduced to Etta, who's the love interest for Butch and Sundance. Now, she's more of the love interest for Sundance. This sequence is basically Sundance holding up a 6-shooter while Etta basically strips down. And keep in mind, this was back during a time when you can get away with a lot in a PG-rated movie. Remember, this was 1969 after all. The MPAA wasn't trying to protect everyone from everything at this point. You could have full frontal female nudity in a PG movie back in the late 60s up through the 70s as long as it wasn't sexual. It's like the rule now where you can have at least one use of the word fuck as long as it's not sexual. Now, when they're robbing the train the second time, that's when it leads to the famous train car getting blown up sequence that a lot of people know from this movie. You know, you think you used enough dynamite there, son? Now, there are 2 sequences that are famous in this movie. The first being that train car getting blown up where there's nothing left, and the final blaze of glory at the very end of this movie. Now, after the train robbery, the movie turns into a cat and mouse game. There's a lawman from Wyoming using an Indian tracker to track Butch and Sundance all along the western frontier. Even though no one really gets shot during this is still a very tense sequence in the sense of, will our outlaws get caught? Tune in next week for the next episode of Gunsmoke. Eventually, Butch and Sundance go back to Etta's house, and that's when they learn the head of the Pacific Union Railroad hired a posse of lawmen to essentially hunt him down until they're dead. And that's when they decide to run to Bolivia and essentially start a new life. Now, once they're in Bolivia, Butch and Sundance have to learn the language to start robbing banks, obviously. They build up a reputation down there as bank robbers. Then the lawmen chasing them down the American West follows them to Bolivia and waits for them to pull their next job. And that's when Butch and Sundance decide to go straight. Now, going straight for a couple of outlaws didn't really last very long and just ended up putting Etta back in the U.S. away from Butch and Sundance. Now, at the very end, there was someone who ratted out Butch and Sundance to the Bolivian police, and it leads to the final shootout. And now, there's no reason to say spoiler alert here, because the ending of this movie is very famous. This is the one that shows Butch and Sundance all shot up, running out, and it goes to a still that transitions from color to sepia and pulls back, and you hear a lot of gunshots going off. And a lot of movies and TV shows have parodied this very ending. And one of the best examples off the top of my head right now is that 70s show in the Dine and Dash episode in its 3rd season, when Eric and Donna have to bolt from the restaurant, all the waiters are trying to stop them. They totally ripped that from this movie. Now let's take a look at how the movie was received. Now keep in mind that I don't know how to access the reviews from 1969 when this movie originally came out, but I can look at what modern audiences think of this movie. So on Rotten Tomatoes, this has a critic score of 90% based on 50 critic reviews, and an audience score of 92% based on 71,141 audience reviews. Now, this movie has a Metacritic score of 66 based on 13 critic reviews, and a user score of 8.7 out of 10 based on 149 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at an 8.0 out of 10 based on 197,139 reviews. Now, it's hard to tell what the budget for a movie like this was, because back in 1969, those budgets weren't really reported. But we can look at the theatrical rental numbers from back in 1969. Now, according to the records at Fox, this movie had to get $13,850,000 in theatrical rentals to just break even. And by December of 1970, a full year after the movie's initial release, it had made $36,825,000. Eventually, it would go on to make $45,953,000, try saying that fast 3 times, in theatrical rentals alone. Now, that extra $9 million could have been from all the re-releases that this movie has had over the last 50 years. Now, online sites are claiming that the movie had a budget of $6.6 million, but I don't know if that's adjusted for inflation and by what year. But what we do know is what the movie made in theatrical rentals, so let's put the 1970 gross of $36,825,000 in 2020 dollars. If Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had it released in 2020, that movie would have made $243,338,271.26 in just theatrical rentals alone. Now let's look at the average price of a movie ticket from 1969 and compare that to today. The average price of a movie ticket at the end of 2019 was $9.37. Now that's the most recent number as of the recording of this episode. And the average price of a movie ticket in 1969 was only $1.42. And if we compare the two numbers, that's an increase of 660% over the last 51 years, not taking inflation into account. Now, if we look at the $1.42 back in 1969, if we adjust that for 2020 inflation, that would be a price of $9.92. Now, let's end this episode off with some final thoughts. Now, I recommend this movie to anyone who is a fan of Westerns that already hasn't seen this. You'll probably enjoy it. Even if you haven't watched this movie for a long time, which I did before this retrospective, I think the last time I saw this movie was about 7-8 years ago. It actually holds up rather well. Now, I wouldn't recommend this movie to someone if they've never seen a Western before. This movie is one of those slow burn Westerns, and there's only really two showdowns the entire movie, so if you're not a fan of Westerns, you might find this movie rather boring. Now, I'll end the episode off with this last little nugget. Robert Redford and Paul Newman were one hell of a dynamic duo back after this movie came out. The two would go on and do one more movie, and that was 1973's The Sting. Now, Robert Redford did want to do a third movie with Paul Newman. He wanted to do the movie A Walk in the Woods with them. A Walk in the Woods would go on to star Robert Redford and Nick Nolte much later, but A Walk in the Woods was originally optioned back in 1998, but ran into a lot of production problems, and Paul Newman's health was basically going to shit by the time they finally got off the ground in the mid-2000s. And as we all know, Paul Newman sadly passed in 2008, and A Walk in the Woods would later come out in 2015. So yeah, we could have had one more movie with Butch and Sundance, but just like the opening blackjack game of this movie, it just wasn't in the cards to happen.